Task Force Roundtable of 2020. We're getting used to the Zoom format for these conversations now. Thank you to everyone who's joining us, and thanks also to my co-chairs, Jackie Spear, Dave Joyce, and John Katko, who co-chaired the Bipartisan Task Force to End Sexual Violence. Today, we convene to discuss human trafficking, and I'm grateful we have this opportunity to shed light on a topic that does not always get the attention it merits. As many in the audience know, human trafficking can involve sex, labor, and sometimes both. One of my main concerns is addressing how the COVID pandemic has exacerbated trafficking in our country. As the pandemic has caused significant financial hardship, including housing insecurity, it's clear that many more people are now economically vulnerable to becoming trafficked. Additionally, as a founder and co-chair of the Bipartisan Opioid Task Force, I've seen how the pandemic has triggered an increase in substance use, another factor that can contribute to trafficking. And while I'm encouraged that reporting to the human trafficking hotline has increased, I'm frankly terrified by how much more difficult it can be for trafficking survivors to seek out help during quarantine. This troubling reality is especially true for minors. Let's remember that the average age of sex trafficking survivors found last year was only 17 years old. With lack of access to school and friends, we all need to be more proactive to ensure they have the opportunity to reach out to someone safe. We got a chilling reminder of this harsh reality in August when more than 36 children were rescued during the bust of a sex trafficking ring in Georgia. With these concerns in mind, I'm proud that members of both parties, including those on our task force, are proactively working on legislation to address trafficking. I've co-sponsored legislation that enhances training to help law enforcement identify trafficking, as well as legislation to strengthen the ability of survivors to get financial restitution. It's also worth noting the Bipartisan Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, which passed the House last year, includes important provisions like allowing tribal courts to prosecute non-Indian offenders for trafficking that occurs on tribal lands. Clearly, there is much more work to be done, but I think our task force is the ideal vehicle for advancing these issues. And with that, I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel. Catherine Chen is the new CEO of Polaris, having previously been its Chief Program Officer. She's an experienced anti-trafficking strategist, and we're so excited to see you, Catherine, in this new leadership role. Vasman Vafa is co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls. As an attorney and advocate, she's done groundbreaking analysis of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. Rights for Girls has done fantastic reporting on trafficking, including its ramifications for girls of color. Dr. Eleanor Gayatan is the Director of Public Policy at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. She has extensive background in combating trafficking around the globe and has worked closely with Congress to pass legislation like the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. And from the FBI, we have Rick Smith from Cleveland, who will join us, and when Mr. Joyce joins us, he may have further introduction. So with that, I would like to start by introducing Catherine Chen to make her statement.
Thank you so much, Representative Kuster and Representatives Joyce, Spear, and Katko for co-chairing this task force, and to all of the task force members for hosting this event today. It's good to also see several members on the task force who are also champions of the cause to end human trafficking, so we're grateful for your work in that space. As Representative Kuster said, I'm the newly appointed CEO of Polaris, and I come to the role after 2 decades in the anti-trafficking field, working on both international and domestic trafficking, on sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and with adults and children around the world. Polaris is a national social justice organization dedicated to ending human trafficking and restoring freedom to survivors.
Take another window.
We respond to the urgent needs of victims and survivors through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we work with survivors, workers, communities, corporations, local and national governments to end trafficking by preventing it. As the operators of the National Human Trafficking Hotline, a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year call and text line for trafficking victims and survivors to get urgent help, we have addressed more than 62,000 instances of sex and labor trafficking over the last 13 years. At its core, human trafficking is the business of exploiting people for profit. The International Labor Organization estimates that sex and labor trafficking generates at least $150 billion a year in criminal profits and victimizes at least 24.9 million people around the world. Data on human trafficking in the US is tough to come by, but we know that sexual violence affects both sex trafficking and labor trafficking victims. Traffickers target victims by taking advantage of their specific vulnerabilities and use both physical and emotional violence to control victims, including coercion and threats, economic abuse, isolation, sexual abuse, and physical violence. As a result, trafficking survivors suffer severe physical and psychological health consequences, which are compounded by economic instability. The lived experiences of sex and labor trafficking survivors informs all of Polaris's work, and we strongly believe that survivors must be part of any meaningful solution. And yet, our systems often fail to adequately support survivors. To this day, potential victims of trafficking are still the parties most likely to be arrested and criminalized. The resulting criminal records further exacerbate economic and psychological vulnerabilities. For the better part of 2 decades, the anti-trafficking fight has focused on a criminal justice approach to tackling this issue. But law enforcement alone cannot solve this problem. We cannot arrest our way out. To effectively end human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, we must also address the broader systems that make people vulnerable in the first place. Housing stability, a strong foster care system, and criminal justice reforms are all examples of the systems we need to strengthen in order to prevent and end trafficking. Nothing makes this more clear than the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. With at least 11 million jobs lost since the pandemic began, economic precarity as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic creates prime conditions for an increase in human trafficking. Pre-pandemic, communities who experience marginalization by race, by income, by gender identity or sexual orientation, by immigration status, were all more likely to be targeted for sex and labor trafficking. Both COVID-19 and the resulting economic impacts have disproportionately affected these same groups, increasing these vulnerabilities. As people continue to lose loved ones and caregivers, their jobs, face evictions and housing instability, and more, these situations become fertile ground for traffickers who prey on the most vulnerable for their own profit. We witnessed the impacts of the pandemic early on. In analyzing the data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, just for April, we saw the number of crisis trafficking situations increase by more than 40%, and the number of situations in which people needed immediate emergency shelter nearly double. We urge you to support federal eviction relief and other targeted policies to keep people in their homes, like emergency rental assistance, as well as emergency funds to support programs for runaway and homeless youth and youth in foster care. Policies that stabilize people economically have a direct impact on preventing a surge in human trafficking resulting from this pandemic. In addition to immediate responses to trafficking in light of the pandemic, Congress will also have the opportunity next year to strengthen our country's long-standing commitment to combating trafficking and supporting victims and survivors. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA, is a bipartisan legislation first passed in 2000 and reauthorized regularly since then, and it is once again up for reauthorization. It will be more important than ever to ensure the fundamentals of our country's response, including funding for victim service providers on the front lines, for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and for legal services to support trafficking victims and survivors in their quest for justice, are strong. These efforts will be critical to not only addressing human trafficking as our country begins to recover from the pandemic, but also in the long term, to avoid losing hard-fought progress in our fight against human trafficking. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
And I was just making a note, your quote about everything that we can do to help keep people stable and housed will reduce human trafficking is, I think, a really important perspective. one of the reasons that I like doing this as a task force rather than straight, our committees are sort of siloed in terms of the issues they can take up, but we can talk about a broad range of housing and economic stability that will make a difference. My colleague Dave Joyce, my co-chair, is now with us. And Dave, if you want to take a minute with an opening statement, now's a good time. And I did a very abbreviated version of introducing Eric Smith, but if you have more comments, the floor is yours, and you may need to unmute.
Thank you, Annie. And I want to thank her for my guest here. And I'd like to introduce Mr. Eric Smith, who is our special agent in charge of the FBI field office in Cleveland. Mr. Smith was named the special agent in charge of the Cleveland office on February 4th, 2019 by the FBI Director Christopher Wray. By that time, he'd been working for the FBI for 20 years, having joined the Bureau in 1999. In 2008, Mr. Smith was selected to serve as supervisor for the Cleveland field office's Counterterrorism Squad and Joint Terrorism Task Force. 2 years later, he deployed to Bagram, Afghanistan, the FBI representative to a counterterrorism task force. After he returned from Afghanistan, Mr. Smith served in a number of roles, including the Cleveland Field Office Assistant Special Agent in charge over counterterrorism and cyber matters in 2013, Chief of Staff to the FBI Deputy Director in 2015, and Special Assistant to the FBI Director in 2016. I'm proud to stand with Special Agent in charge Smith in his fight against human trafficking. The harsh reality is that human trafficking is one of the fastest growing forms of transnational crime. It's estimated over 40 million people are victims of human trafficking each year, resulting in profits exceeding $150 billion. And that's a billion with a B, unfortunately. In 2018 alone, the National Human Trafficking Hotline received roughly 500 calls about crimes in Ohio. A recent study estimates that more than 4,200 Ohio juveniles are at risk of becoming victims of human trafficking. All those statistics go to show how critical any and all the efforts to eliminate this crime are, and the efforts to support victims and ensure they receive the justice they deserve. So with that, I want to thank you, not only Mr. Smith, but all of our panelists for taking the time to join us today and participate in this important discussion for all we can do to combat human trafficking. Also, I want to thank Representative Kuster, my fellow co-chairs, Representative Katko and Spire, for these roundtables as we continue to take place as we navigate this unfortunate ongoing pandemic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joyce, for being with us. And I had mentioned to our panelists that we'll have members come and go throughout the discussion. So right now, I'd love to introduce Yasmin Bafa, who is the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls. So Yasmin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm Yasmin Bafa, co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls. We are a human rights organization based here in Washington, D.C., and we work to eliminate gender-based violence against young women and girls in the U.S. We know that sexual violence is incredibly pervasive in the United States. 1 in 4 American girls will experience some form of sexual abuse before even reaching the age of 18. But one of the more egregious forms of sexual violence impacting our girls today is sex trafficking and exploitation. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic have really impacted the issue of sex trafficking. But I think it's important from the outset to understand that the community we work with and on behalf of was already marginalized. And this is the community who is most impacted by COVID-19. We know that communities of color have not only made up a number of our nation's essential workers, but they've also made up a significant portion of COVID-related deaths. These are the communities that are most impacted by sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. We know from all of the work and research across the country that there are some very glaring racial and gender disparities among sex trafficking survivors. We know that women and children of color are overrepresented among sex trafficking victims. Here in DC, our partners at Courtney's House report that over 90% of the trafficked youth that they serve are Black and Latinx. In places like King County, Washington, where Black people are less than 7% of the general population, however, over 50% of their child sex trafficking victims in that county are Black children. In places like Louisiana, Black girls are only 19% of the youth population, but they are 50% of child sex trafficking victims. in places like Alaska, where Native women and girls are less than 8% of the general population, but are 33% of the trafficking survivors. It's important to talk about the ways in which COVID-19 has really exacerbated vulnerabilities and increased sex trafficking of children and youth. We've seen this all across the country as poverty is worsening, unemployment is becoming more rampant, people are experiencing loss of wages, benefits, and dealing with evictions and housing instability. People are becoming more vulnerable to the conditions that create sexual exploitation and trafficking. Just recently, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a dramatic rise in reports of child sexual exploitation to their cyber tip line and to their agency. We know that providers here in DC have been at capacity. They've even had to halt new intakes because they simply couldn't deal with the number of referrals that they were getting. Here in DC, we've also witnessed an increase in familial trafficking. Again, as families get increasingly desperate, this is something that we have noticed. Our partners in LA County, the largest county in the country, have said that their child sex trafficking hotline has been ringing off the hook since the pandemic hit. We've also seen sharp rises in other forms of sexual exploitation, including landlord trafficking. So we have had cases reported to us from Hawaii, DC, California, where landlords seek to take advantage of vulnerable tenants, oftentimes single mothers and other young women. And it's important to realize that this falls under the federal definition of sex trafficking. So what this tells us is that demand for paid sex seems undeterred despite the pandemic. Sex buyers are still pursuing sex with women and children. We can cite examples and direct quotes from buyers from the various John boards that we have noted throughout the pandemic. But the important takeaway is that these attitudes show a lack of regard for not only the safety and well-being of women and children, but for public safety as a whole, because this behavior really puts all of us at risk. The last area I want to quickly touch on is the importance of advocating for the release of incarcerated survivors. We know that trafficking victims are too often criminalized for their own exploitation, despite the fact that many states have passed what are known as safe harbor and immunity laws. We are still seeing survivors criminalized. We know that prisons and jails have a very high risk of COVID contraction. The Sentencing Project has really recently released a report showing around 2,000 youth who have been incarcerated nationwide have been infected with COVID-19. And so this is a really important area of advocacy for survivors of trafficking. Placement, again, is one of the challenges that we're having, because even if there's a desire to release these children and survivors, oftentimes accessing housing can be very difficult, or even foster care and child welfare have really had a lapse in doing new placements as a result of the pandemic. One of the other challenges that's directly related is that even though we are having difficulty releasing children and survivors, many jurisdictions are engaging in compassionate release programs where unfortunately violent perpetrators are being released. So at the same time that we are struggling to get incarcerated survivors out, survivors and vulnerable communities are reporting to us that their abusers have been released with no notice to victims in that jurisdiction and no conditions of release or supervision. And so again, we're seeing examples from Hawaii, parts of LA County, as well as DC, where this is happening. And there's many things that we can do. I know my colleagues and I are eager to talk about some of the legislative vehicles that are being proposed, as well as opportunities for reauthorizations that are currently pending, as well as the urgent need for funds for what is an incredibly high-risk population that is seeing an increase in vulnerability and exploitation. And so with that, I'll conclude my remarks, but I look forward to answering some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us and for your leadership in the field and giving a voice to the survivors. With that, Mr. Katko, would you like to make a few remarks? Thank you so much for joining us. If you unmute, the floor will be yours.
I'm going to talk before I muted myself for once. Usually I end up prattling on before I realize I haven't done that. So thank you all for being here. It's really an honor. And Eric, I see you as an FBI agent and as a former federal prosecutor for 20 years. I remember duty calls where I did a lot of cartel-level drug traffickers and violent criminals. But when I was on duty and I had to do these child exploitation and sexual trafficking calls, when the agents came in, it was just, it just deeply affected me. And I was, at one point I was down on the southwest border in El Paso, Texas, and the drug trafficking organizations have well-worn smuggling routes. And those smuggling routes are not just for drugs, as you all know. They're for human beings too. And the vast majority of women who go into that smuggling network to try and get in the United States end up being, going into sexual slavery or getting sexually assaulted on their journey to the northern border of Mexico. And that always deeply affected me. And saw the same type of thing when I was on the northern border, when I was in Syracuse, New York for 15 years as a prosecutor. So it really has had a deep effect on me. And the experience gave me a firm understanding of how horrific this exploitation can affect anyone in our community, and how important it is that we employ a systemic approach to recognize and protecting victims among us. Last Congress, I worked very closely with anti-human trafficking advocates, law enforcement, and the trucking industry to reduce the No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act, which I was very happy with. The legislation recognizes the unfortunate role that our nation's transportation network often plays in moving victims of human trafficking from one location to another. And for this reason, my legislation, which has since been signed into law, permanently disqualifies any individual who has been convicted of a human trafficking crime from ever operating a commercial motor vehicle again. And I look forward to hearing from our panelists on ways that we can build on these efforts and continue to make our community safer for everyone. I also want to take this time to recognize the McMahon Ryan Child Advocacy Center and Vera House. Those are two organizations in my district that are on the front lines of the fight against human trafficking. These organizations work tirelessly to protect victims in Central New York and prevent these heinous crimes. And whenever I meet with these groups, it is always concerning and gut-wrenching to hear about the ways in which human trafficking is interconnected with many of the other problems facing our communities such as the opioid epidemic. So I hope today's roundtable can serve as an open conversation on these issues, new challenges presented by the coronavirus pandemic, and ways in which we can work together to combat human trafficking in the US and around the world. And before I conclude, I just want to commend all of you who spend your waking hours, vast majority of waking hours working on this issue, the panelists today. I can't tell you enough how important it is to have you folks on the front line. If you're not doing what you're doing, the world will be a much worse place. So I commend all of you. And I know when I was a prosecutor and I saw those cases, it was thoroughly depressing at times and it would be gut-wrenching. But at the same token, the ability to dust yourself off and go after the bad guys is what it's all about. And you got to keep doing it, man. So I want to say to all of you, thank you very much for what you're doing. And hopefully we can learn from you and do more to help you going forward. And with that, Ann, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Katko from New York, for joining us. And we now have Representative Susan Davis from California is with us. Susan, did you want to say a few words? We're partway through our panel, so you can also wait and ask the questions, but if you want to say anything now.
You know, Annie, I'm happy to wait. I really had a question around the impact of COVID in not being able to identify young people who are being trafficked essentially in plain sight. We count on our school personnel to be able to identify and really have a talk and how to do that, how to be able to do that. So that was one of my questions, but I'm happy to wait. Absolutely. Okay. And I'm not going to be able to stay a long time, but I'm happy to do that. And thank you for all your efforts and for the other panelists as well.
Great, and thank you for being with us. I know I have a similar question. I've been talking to teachers and school social workers over the past 6 months and their fears about how children are doing, and even talking to our governor and to school officials about one of the themes behind trying to open in person at least a day or two a week is to get eyes on these kids that may be very vulnerable to abuse and neglect, and even so far as sex trafficking. So now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Eleanor Gayetan, who is the Director of Public Policy at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Dr. Gayetan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me. So a beautiful thing about age is that you have some sense of legislative history. And so I want to remind all of us of something extraordinary about our work in human trafficking here in the US, and that is it began 20 years ago with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act as a national, the bill addressed the national phenomena of human trafficking. And it really was because faith-based and feminist groups and people around the world were seeing what was happening as the Soviet Union collapsed. And people were drawn to opportunities around the world that they thought were babysitting or modeling or elder care, which turned out to be often commercial sex and labor enslavement. So I was in USAID Romania in 2000 when the bill passed, and one of my jobs was to fund shelter for women who were being repatriated, typically from Turkey or Germany. They would come back with nothing. And these were 18, 19-year-olds, and they had been ruined, and they were almost like zombies, but no one knew how to serve them. And so very often they ran away within weeks of getting to that USAID funded shelter, and it was like a penitentiary. So my trafficking shelter program was a disaster in 2000, and we had no idea how to serve victims. So we've come a long way.
Oops, I think we have a...
In about 2005, the TVPRA domestic human trafficking, both labor and sex, and was sponsored by Representative Maloney. Sorry, my internet seems to be a bit bouncy. But with 2005, we started focusing at home. And then in 2008, Congress mandated a study at DOJ of the scope of the problem of sex trafficking in particular. 3 or 5 years later, the Urban Institute came back and said, we really can't tell you the prevalence of trafficking, but we can tell you that millions of dollars is being made by the pimps. So 20 years later, we know a lot more about sex and labor trafficking as a result of the iterative process. So TVPRA gave us an opportunity to go back and learn more. So 2005, 2008, 2011, we kept improving the bill. And I want to suggest 4 specific areas where improvement is needed and Congress can act. One is acknowledging the profound harm. And I'm going to focus on sex trafficking because that is what is mostly the human trafficking experience in the United States. One of the few excellent studies on the health consequences of this experience is that the majority suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and an astronomical 41.5% of victims have attempted suicide at least once. They're also very young. Courtney's House, Yasmin mentioned our local, only one organization serving survivors. Courtney's House is at capacity, and it has about 70 youth between the ages of 11 and 21, all from foster care. So the foster care system has proved to be an absolutely disastrous place from which many people are trafficked. And we just have to get a handle on that because these are taxpayer funds funding a system that too often pushes kids into the worst experiences of trauma imaginable. So in addition to about 40 years of data that shows a direct correlation between child sexual abuse and prostitution, we know that many of the adults who are in prostitution started that life because they were groomed as children for this awful fate. So there's a very blurry line between sex trafficked minors and coerced young adults in prostitution, because prostitution and sex trafficking are intrinsically linked. And yet the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, passed by the House last year, eliminated a very few programs for girls and youth victims of sex trafficking. We're not sure why, but we think the DV community really fears opening up its programming to sex trafficking victims because the harm is so great and the services are expensive. I work with a Louisiana shelter with adolescents ages 11 to 18. Several of them are in the program for 2 years. Many of them have babies, and they learn life skills, job skills. They have to really become, able to function in our society, and that's very difficult, medical, psychological, legal services. So I think I'm telling you all this because I want to put the context for something we're witnessing, and that is an effort to decriminalize the entire sex trade, including pimping, brothel owning, and sex buying, and that will only increase to a demand and more victimization. And this isn't theoretical. Yasmin and I had to fight hard against a DC council bill that was going to decriminalize the entire sex trade. And it got very far. It had 5 DC councilmen sponsoring it. Actually, council women too. 5 members of the council sponsored it. It was until we went door to door to every council member with youth, with teenagers who had been found in trap houses all over DC, that we got some traction in saying, you know, this will endanger many of our most vulnerable people in this city. So when you start hearing about this decriminalization movement, which really is across the country and it's heavily funded, be very wary. This is not the solution. You cannot make the sex trade safe. You can't make it healthy. And therefore we have to reduce it. To reduce the demand for commercial sex is the true primary prevention, not just awareness building, not just going into schools and warning kids, which we should do more of. We need to actually have, like the DOJ COPS program, should be intertwining anti-demand programming into every single anti-trafficking program around the country. It's happening in an ad hoc way because really smart prosecutors and really smart detectives can see if we don't make men stop buying sex, we can't end, we can't eliminate, we can't prevent sex trafficking. So accountability should be at the top of our list. Last fall, HHS, DOJ, and State Department were working on a demand reduction plan because it's actually in the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act that Yasmin and I both worked on in 2015. We're supposed to have a national strategy that says accountability, don't buy sex. It was shelved. It was supposed to be announced at a January 2020 summit that was at the White House. It disappeared. There were no elements of demand reduction in that White House summit. We really wanted to know why. I have had 5 sources tell me that because Robert Kraft, a celebrity NFL owner, was arrested for paid sex in an illegal massage industry, nobody wanted to touch demand because it might hurt Robert Kraft's case. That's disgusting. And that is happening all the time. The demand for sex is protected still by our institutions. It's got to stop. Third, we have to stop relying on victims to prosecute sex trafficking cases. I want to read a great quote from Joe Scaramucci. He's a McLennan County, Texas sheriff. He's a detective, and he says, we have to learn to investigate around victims just like you would on a homicide case. I've never had a homicide victim testify in court. But these initiatives are very ad hoc. Again, we haven't had any direction from DOJ, not the Obama administration, not the Trump administration, saying to people across the country that we need to develop these cases. Seattle has done a very good job. Seattle, Washington is one of the greatest places where prosecutors take more time to put a case together, and they prosecute the demand for facilitating sex trafficking. And they've taken down some big rings, some big busts, but it takes time. So we can't have that short-term desire for a couple of arrests that just keep feeding the system. The last point is, don't let these digital platforms off the hook. All the trafficking is going on online. We have to reform the Communications Decency Act. Without CDA 230 reform, every child in your life is in danger. The predators are online. So because there is no incentive, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, they have no incentive to police the internet, and child sexual abuse material is rampant on the internet. So there is a great bill, the Earn It Act. Yesterday it was introduced by Representatives Garcia and Wagner. It's coming over from the Senate, where Judiciary Committee 22-0 passed the Earn It Act out of Judiciary because there's like, enough is enough. Big tech is making billions, and yet it is ignoring the trafficking that surges on its platforms. And that's because of CDA 230. They have no incentive to police their own platforms. Please pass the Earn It Act. You will hear the sky will fall. You will hear that the internet will break. We faced that. Yasmin and I worked on the FOSTA-SESTA legislation 2 years ago. The internet didn't break, and now it's a little safer for kids who are being trafficked on Backpage. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. These are all really good suggestions, and I appreciate your history too for us. You know, one of the things about serving in Congress, you tackle an issue and you're coming in the midstream, and it's helpful to know that. Mr. Katko, I have a quick question for you. I may need to go speak on the floor. Would you be able to stick around for a little bit?
Despite the fact that I'm a substantial downgrade from you, yes, I can stick around.
No worries at all. All right. Well, I'm pleased that Eric Smith is with us from the FBI. And Eric, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Representative Kuster and other distinguished members of Congress. Thank you, Representative Joyce, for your kind introduction. I often say and apologize for my bio because my mother wrote it, so I will you have to give me a bit of a pass there. But certainly my pleasure to appear here along with this panel of professionals, which just gave great opening statements, all of whom are involved in this fight against human trafficking. And as the special agent in charge of the Cleveland office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I oversee
Okay, we're going now.
of federal crimes, including human trafficking committed in the Northern District of Ohio. So by way of background, I will say that in 2003, the FBI launched what we call the Innocence Lost National Initiative to address the emerging epidemic of domestic juvenile sex trafficking. And this issue really hit home here in Ohio with a culmination of the investigation called Precious Cargo in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where in a major federal investigation by the FBI led to the arrest of 17 separate sex traffickers from the Toledo, Ohio area. And as a result of the case, about 151 victims of sex trafficking were recovered. 78 of those were from Toledo. So in response, FBI Cleveland established a task force in 2006 in Toledo, Cleveland, and throughout Northern Ohio to address this important issue. So intelligence developed through these numerous investigative platforms, and since that time has indicated that juvenile prostitution activity continues throughout the state, with numerous traffickers victimizing children both in Ohio and throughout the United States, where they're taken to engage in commercial sexual activity. Since 2006, again, dozens of sex traffickers have been convicted on federal and state charges, with many receiving sentences of 20 years or more and some receiving life sentences. Over 100 child victims have been recovered as a result of these investigations. The use of internet, as we've discussed, remains at the heart of these crimes. The recruitment and subsequent grooming of victims is often accomplished through the use of social media. Over time, the applications used by traffickers and their techniques have changed, but the premise is the same. Gain the trust of a potential victim, offer them affection, money, or other material items, and then introduce them to the world of sex trafficking. Traffickers often use force, fraud, and coercion to accomplish their goals. And likewise, the introduction or continued use of illegal drugs remains a very strong tool of traffickers to gain and maintain control of their victims. Traffickers display a very keen ability to adapt to the characteristics of their intended victim, or to change the methods used to recruit others into the trade. For example, the closure of Backpage.com, which we just discussed, which is a notorious online marketplace of illegal sexual services, caused really only a minor impediment as dozens of other online marketplaces or applications quickly emerged. So while not entirely related to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a move toward increasing use of the internet, which is of course no surprise. Where in the past we may have seen juvenile victims walking the street, we now see more online activity. A recent trend involves, an unfortunate recent trend involves the sale of online content as a means of generating revenue. And under this scheme, an individual who may be under the control of a trafficker posts sexually explicit content online and then charges users to access that content. And this content often contains visual depictions of child victims. Payment for the content is accomplished through various online payment platforms. So investigators have also seen an increase in the number of cases in which subjects attempt to entice minors online, resulting in the travel of the subject or the victim to engage in sexual activity. So the FBI very much appreciates the efforts of Congress to enact legislation giving law enforcement the tools to continue the fight against human trafficking. Although much has been said about juvenile sex trafficking, the FBI remains committed to curbing the sex trafficking of adult victims who are trafficked through force, fraud, or coercion. Finally, I would note that the FBI uses a victim-centered approach to these types of investigations, focusing first and foremost on the welfare of the victims, while vigorously pursuing charges against both the trafficker and consumer of illegal sexual activity. Thank you for the invitation to join you today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Eric. And what you do on the front lines every day. I have a colleague in the U.S. Attorney's Office who's still there. She's been doing sex trafficking and child exploitation cases for 20 years now. And how she gets up every day and is able to deal with that, I don't know, but she has a remarkable spirit, and God bless her for doing it. God bless all of you for what you're doing. Has everyone in the panel been able to have an opportunity to speak? Okay, great. So let's, Susan, I think you're ready to, if you're still there, if you want to ask a question.
Sure, I can.
Sure.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I basically presented the concern that with COVID, with students not in school, with the inability to even monitor video, what should we be doing? How can we create an environment, I guess, where perhaps schools can follow up a little differently than they would ordinarily under the law? I'm not sure what that is. So I just wanted to throw that out and see whether or not it's a problem, which I think it is, and what we can be doing about it. I think the other questions have to do with the extent of incarceration for sex trafficking crimes and the success that we've had with rehabilitation. There's a lot of interest now in trying to do that, diverting, but I also know that, you know, that's not always successful either. So, you know, given where we are, what are the follow-up legislation that's really required, and how do we impact this in a way that begins to deal with the symptoms as well as what we present? Thank you.
We can, if all four of you want to comment on it, just raise your hand and I can call on you if you want, one of the panels want to comment on it. So Yasmin, go ahead, please.
So I'm happy to try to tackle that. It's absolutely a problem. I think it's definitely in the issue of sex trafficking, but also other forms of child abuse. Schools often function as not only a protective buffer for children and youth, but you know, the interaction with school counselors, therapists, trusted teachers, those trusted adults in children's lives, that lapse has really had an impact. I think there is data to support that reports of child abuse and, you know, have gone down, but we know that that's just because children are no longer coming into contact with those reporters, right? And people to identify that abuse. It's been very difficult in the child sex trafficking context. For example, I did a panel with a clinician and a pediatrician out of Atlanta and Pittsburgh last weekend, where they were saying, you know, when they do their one-on-one you know, virtual check-ins with children and their patients, the parents are there. You know, they're in the background. They can hear what's being said. It's so much more difficult to have trusted and one-on-one conversations and interactions with children, which make it incredibly difficult to identify instances of abuse and exploitation. To your point about what we can do, I think, you know, it's very complicated. The pandemic and the difficulty in responding to it has really made it challenging because, you know, you have to balance the safety and well-being of teachers and their families, and as well as just the reality that so many abused and exploited children are falling through the cracks in ways that we never could have imagined. So it's something that I know people are working on, but it is an absolute noticeable shift, and those children are falling through the cracks. In terms of responses for incarcerated survivors or you know, criminalization of survivors, we know that trafficking victims are definitely being criminalized for not only prostitution offenses, despite being children. So, you know, we at Rights for Girls have a campaign called No Such Thing as a Child Prostitute to help interrogate, you know, the oxymoron of a child prostitute. If children can't consent, how is it they're being criminalized for, you know, being exploited? Despite the fact that many states have adopted what are known as safe harbor or immunity laws to try to tackle this injustice, kids are still being trafficked, still being criminalized for other offenses that are directly related to their exploitation. So girls, for example, are overrepresented among status offenders, things like running away from home, truancy. Our systems are too often criminalizing the behavior without looking underneath the charge, right? So those are huge problems we're still seeing. I think adult victims are absolutely continuing to get criminalized. Something that, you know, we and many others are pushing for is the decriminalization of survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking, understanding that this is another form of gender-based violence. And, we don't criminalize victims of child abuse. We don't criminalize victims of, rape and sexual assault. We should not be criminalizing these victims and survivors either. But to your question about diversion and interventions, yes, it can be very difficult. I think because of the years of complex trauma, the fact that many of these victims have been let down and betrayed by every adult in their life who should have cared, it makes it very difficult to trust systems. Many of them have had bad experiences with foster care, have been incarcerated as kids, and then later as adults. So yes, services necessarily don't stick the first, second, third time, but I do think that we have seen very promising results with, therapeutic interventions, long-term care, care that's culturally specific, gender responsive, and that is able to kind of have a wraparound services and address the whole person, right? If they're pregnant and parenting, if they need vocational skills, if they need legal services. So I think individualized care is critical to having successful outcomes with respect to this population, and that's very difficult because we do have an overall lack of funding and appropriate services.
Okay, does anybody else want to add to that? Any of the other panelists? Yeah, Catherine.
Thank you. So I just wanted to add a little bit of the data backing also to what Yasmin was saying. I think when we go back and look at who child sex trafficking victims are and how they're being targeted and how they're being victimized, number one, we're talking about intimate partners, right? People who are posing as boyfriends, that kind of thing online, as Eric was saying. And then second, it's family. And I think it's a very important thing to remember that there's enough misinformation that's floating out there about who child trafficking, who child traffickers are, that there's, stories about vans and stories about kind of viral misinformation and that kind of thing, and to focus very clearly on people who are posing as relationships and people who are family members are the top two perpetrators of child sex trafficking.
Is the punishment for them seen as significant? Or do so many of these traffickers get away, I guess, easily? And I know that there are others who want to ask questions. So, is there a perception that?
I think one of the challenges that we have is trafficking although we have trafficking laws in every state and we have federal laws that criminalize trafficking, they're very difficult cases to bring. They are very, victim intensive, right? They require the participation of victims. They are just have a higher burden of proof, right? That force, fraud, or coercion standard is very, very difficult. And the reality is that most trafficking prosecutions currently happen under pimping and pandering statutes, right? So state prostitution statutes, which is one of the other reasons Eleanor was alluding to. One of the concerns that many allies have is that with the repeal, with this movement to decriminalize prostitution, which would result in the repeal of pimping, pandering, procurement, facilitation statutes, you are removing these lesser penalties for trafficking. These are critical tools that investigators have throughout the states to be able to hold traffickers accountable. And I think people fail to realize that, even if we're leaving trafficking statutes in place, the repeal of these laws is basically akin, what we say is like, it would be like repealing second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter, but saying, don't worry, we still have first-degree murder on the books. These are lesser penalties. And so that's the reality of what we're seeing. One of the practical complications is that in some states, these are misdemeanors. So what ends up happening is child traffickers are, basically plead out under these charges. They have very low supervision, right, as conditions of supervision under probation. And so unless adult probation and, other systems are talking to one another, they may not be realizing that these are child sex traffickers that they have under their supervision. And as a result, under compassionate release programs, we're seeing a lot of these individuals re-released and then re-victimizing. So these are just some of the complications that I don't think necessarily people are picking up on, but they are absolutely the daily realities of the young people that we work with and what they're reporting.
Thank you very much. David, Joyce, you got a question, did you say? I'm sorry, Eleanor, did you want to add anything to that quickly?
I just wanted to add that Congress has been the real leader in thinking through and passing excellent legislation. It's the ad hoc nature across the country. Every jurisdiction is facing this problem, and they get very little guidance from the Department of Justice. I mean, I see the Department of Justice shoveling millions of dollars out the door to programs that often are providing case management services, not direct services, not medical or shelter. So more supervision, but more information sharing, but more guidance. So there's just too much of a patchwork of approach across the country when we know so much and can do a better job.
Okay. Eric, did you want to add anything before we go to Representative Joyce?
No, just very briefly, well, I guess, yes, that, Dr. Gatan spoke about the need, I think, for housing, or I'm sorry, one of the individuals spoke about the need for increased housing for folks. And I think that speaks to the very nature of how difficult it is in a victim-centered approach to these investigations, where these folks, the folks that are being trafficked, typically come back to this life over and over and over again. And it's very difficult for us to maintain, contact with them as we go through these prosecutions, because they're moving from place to place to place. So without a long-term housing solution, it's very hard for us. It's very time intensive and resource intensive for us to stay up with the individual that is being victimized. So I just throw that out there as part of some other discussions that were already talked about this morning.
All right, thank you. David Joyce, you got a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Katko. Well, while I got you there, Special Agent Smith, you're not going to get away without a question from me. So people often seem to forget that even though Ohio is in the center of the Midwest, it also is a coastal entry and a border state. That comes with several points of international entry, including international airport, shipping centers, and of course, numerous ports along Lake Erie. While these are critical centers of commerce and travel, they provide ample opportunity to traffic humans in the opioids we've seen devastate our communities. Can you expand on the connection, if any, that you've seen between drug and human trafficking rings? And what are the trends and points of entry for internationally trafficked humans and drugs?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Obviously, we do, and we are concerned about, the movement of not just, human trafficking for labor, human trafficking for sex across the borders. And Ohio is, of course, not immune to any of that. I don't know if I'm seeming to get a little feedback here, so I don't know if you're hearing me clearly, but if you are, okay, very good. We would just think the best way to address this is to encourage our, congressional support for legislation such as the STOP Act, which was already talked about today. We think that's very important. We also believe that partnering piece could just be a general statement about our reliance on partners, including our CBP partners, which we really, really rely on heavily. So we're partnering with them across the board with all the task forces that we have. We've established task forces in Toledo, Cleveland, and a number of our other areas. So continuing to partner with our CBP partners, the legislation like STOP. And then I think I wanted to get back briefly to some of the education that somebody brought up earlier, which is the fact that folks are not in school right now. We are trying to come up with different platforms to get information out to the folks that are getting a lot of their news online. We're getting and seeing children spend a lot of time on platforms such as YouTube, on streaming platforms. So if we're not getting that education to our folks, our guidance counselors in the schools, we need to better educate those children in other platforms. And a way to do that would be public service announcements through a variety of different platforms that can help educate these kids that they're not, things that they're not seeing normally in school. So I would leave it at that. Let somebody else jump on and follow up.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to add to what Agent Smith said? Okay, let's try Representative Maloney. Carolyn, are you on still? I don't think so. Okay, well, I have a couple of questions I want to ask if as long as we have a minute here, unless there's any other representatives on here that want to ask a question. I think Ann is still down on the floor. So, okay, let me ask this question. Agent Smith, to start with you, I've seen what happens with the internet and the kids that are unsupervised on the internet and what can happen. And the stories are amazingly troubling. But in your experience, has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the ability of law enforcement to investigate these cases of human trafficking? Has COVID impeded you at all?
It's not in any significant sense. It's not impeded us. Credible cases of human trafficking that come to our attention by their nature require our prompt attention. So while we're not seeing the COVID pandemic impact us, I mean, we've been largely, 100% staffed here in this office for the last 2 or 3 months. So we're up and running. We are seeing individuals move toward the internet as a function of not being able to get out in the community. So we're tackling that in every way that we can. So we're trying to have a larger presence, online. We do struggle with the numbers of individuals online, undercover employees that we need to have those chats to monitor that traffic. So it is tough for us. It's time intensive and resource intensive, which is why, I talked about earlier about the need to collaborate and partner with our task force officers here, our state and local partners, which is critical for us to compound and give us more of a force multiplier of our presence online. So while we're 100% here in the office, the sheer numbers of things that we're seeing online cause it to be a very considerable challenge.
Ms. Did I say your last name, Vafa? Is that how you pronounce it? Yes, got a question for you. You stated in your testimony that as a result of compassionate releases, there's many traffickers are being released back into the community without giving notice to the victims or providing any conditions of release. Is that what's happening? And if that is, what can be done about it from a legislative standpoint for us in Congress?
So I think, one of the challenges around that is, we've recognized, and I think rightly so, that we need to be mindful of the harms of, over incarceration, especially during a pandemic. Prisons and jails are sites of, major transmissions, right? Which pose a threat to all of society. However, what we are seeing is the lack of attention to the specific types of offenses that certain individuals perpetrated. Issues are complicated by pretrial, release and people who are on probation or just lack of conditions of release have really caused this issue that we have seen in a number of jurisdictions. The way it came to our attention was survivors and survivor serving partners, providers in the community reached out to us and said, we have traffickers who are out, who are contacting our youth in our program, and they, some of them are on ankle monitors, some of them are not, some of them have no conditions of release. A number of our partners in Hawaii were particularly, distressed over this. They received no notice, even though, according to their state law, they are supposed to receive notice when perpetrators are released. Obviously, at the federal level, there is a requirement to provide notice, but each state has different laws pertaining to that. So I think some of it is because of pretrial detention. A lot of those people have been released on bail or just, for public safety. But the fact that there is no oversight or safety plan for their alleged victims in those cases has really just exacerbated vulnerabilities, distress for victims. I can tell you that in DC, again, according to our partners at Courtney's House that serve trafficked youth, they counted 22 adult male perpetrators who had been released into the DC community who were directly involved in trafficking their youth. So those are the numbers we're talking about. In Hawaii, it was similar. They said they didn't hear anything from the court. They didn't hear anything from prosecuting attorneys' offices. They found out because survivors are being called by their abusers saying, I'm out.
Wait,
right?
is there a legal requirement right now? Does anyone know to notify the victims in those cases? Because if there isn't, perhaps that's something that we can pursue. Does anyone know?
I'm not aware of that, but we'll definitely see if we can get an answer for you.
Now let us know, because obviously the sex offender registry, if you're a sex offender, you have to notify people when you get, when they have to be notified when they get out. But if you're not a sex offender, but if you're involved in sexual trafficking, human trafficking, I kind of think that maybe they should get a heads up when they're getting out, and maybe that's something we can pursue legislatively. You know, Dave, maybe we can think about that. So yeah, that I'd like to hear. Anybody else want to add anything on that subject, Eleanor or Catherine? No? Okay, Kath, I got a question for you. On your testimony, you stated that in April of this year, you saw the number of crisis trafficking situations increase by more than 40%. Has that continued now since April, or do you have any more updated data from that?
Thank you for the question. The crisis calls have continued. We are not as clear on the percentages at this moment, but I did actually want to raise one other issue that has come up as a result of COVID, which is really the widespread viral misinformation about human trafficking and how it's impacting the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I think that there's already a conversation going on among Congress members about QAnon and conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. But what we're seeing is that spread of misinformation is actually damaging the anti-trafficking fight, and it's really impacting the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The trafficking movement, for the first 2 decades has really focused very much on trying to get people to understand what trafficking is, who is actually vulnerable, who traffickers are, what their tactics actually are, as opposed to kind of widespread myths that are out there about what trafficking might be. And as this viral misinformation has spread, it's leading to people giving the National Human Trafficking Hotline call after call after call about rumors that they're seeing on social media. And what that does ultimately is prevent human trafficking victims who are in urgent need of help from being able to get through to us and to get the kind of help that they need. So I did want to make sure that this committee was also aware of that in the larger conversations that you all are having about misinformation.
Okay, and anybody else want to add anything to that?
I would add just something briefly with that. And, we talk a lot about human trafficking and people think it may be a foreign problem, but quite the opposite. It is very much a domestic problem. If you think about, the largest percentage of and greatest number of sex trafficking victims are U.S. citizens. So it's something that's sort of a myth that people have that it's, and then the trafficking of itself is a bit of a misnomer. You can be trafficked and never leave your home. And I think it's important for people to recognize that. And the other thing I would say is that in just some of the statistics that we have here, we have cases in every one of our 56 field offices. And last year alone, we've opened up over 1,300 separate trafficking investigations. So we don't know if the problem is growing or if we're just putting more of an influence into the violation. So, some of our other colleagues on the line might have a better better knowledge of that, but it's obviously something that there's no end in sight to right now. So it's taken all of our investigative efforts to stay up with the challenge.
Eleanor, yes.
I want to mention that it's not true that trafficking has slowed in the US under the COVID conditions. Commercial sex tracks nationwide are thriving. Unfortunately, those who buy sex tend to be high-risk individuals. But what's happened is law enforcement, local, is backed way off. They don't want to put people in jail even for a few hours or overnight. So cops have backed off. We hear that again and again and again in task force meetings around the country. And yet women are vulnerable. People aren't making any money. They're lured back on the track and stuck in that whole cycle of violence again. So if, again, crickets from Department of Justice give guidance to law enforcement nationwide, but if they were issuing more misdemeanor citations and fees, that would be helpful, because every study of sex buyers finds that demand is reduced through very simple shaming tactics or booting cars or letters home. Something like 65 to 75% of male sex buyers who buy sex regularly wouldn't do it if acknowledgement went home in the form of a letter. So there's some very simple ways we could really reduce the demand for commercial sex, which drives these markets.
Right. Yeah, Catherine, yes.
I just wanted to add one additional thing, which is, I said this in my opening remarks, but I think, that when you go back and look at the data, the number one driver of someone ending up in a sex trafficking situation, what makes them vulnerable, is housing instability, right? And so I think you're going to hear us continue to say that any opportunity to stabilize emergency housing support, to make sure that people stay in their homes in the middle of a pandemic when people are losing jobs, is a very core way to make sure that there aren't more trafficking victims ending up in this situation.
Yeah, and I'll just add as a quick aside, it's frustrating right now, both the leadership in the House and Senate have really failed in getting another COVID package together, because that all these things that you don't really think about when you're having your political back and forth really are in the mix and are at risk, like you said. I mean, getting another stimulus check to those people, allow them to stay in their homes, really important. And passing legislation that helps with the renters, living rent-free until the crisis is over, it's very important. All those things that you don't need, all these different consequences of us failing to act are part of this. We need to make sure we understand that, and we're hoping for a miracle in the next day or so in that regard. Is there any other members of Congress on the call here that would like to ask a question? I think we're kind of done there, but before I finish and conclude, the four panelists, God bless you for what you're doing. Is there something that you wanted to say, or hopefully you could have an opportunity to say that you didn't? And if you are, feel free to raise your hand. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, and getting back to Congressman Joyce's question earlier, he talked a little bit about drug trafficking and human trafficking. There is a bit of a delineation there. I don't know if the other panelists will concur with this, but a lot of the human traffickers believe that they're almost a cut above the drug traffickers insofar as that the drug traffickers have a one-time supply. They believe that they're whatever they're providing to the to their user. They have to use it and then they come back for more. Human traffickers believe that that they can shop their wares and that can come back again and again and again for the same product. And so they believe that they're cut above the drug traffickers. And that's a frustrating piece for us. And as we move toward on both sides, on the drug trafficking and on the human trafficking side, they're moving towards online platforms. And one of the things that we would ask Congress to really look at is getting us the tools that we need to get to and break through some of this end-to-end encryption, where individuals are continually going online and know that they are protected from law enforcement's visibility because they're using platforms that we just can't get to. And that's across the board on all of the violations that we see. So I'd be remiss if I didn't at least bring up the challenge that we see with respect to lawful access and gaining lawful access into these platforms where this kind of criminal activity is just running completely unsupervised and unwatched. We can get into somebody's sock drawer with a warrant from a judge, but we can't get into somebody's cell phone. And that's a very frustrating thing for us to do.
Yeah, I'm on Homeland Security, and a parallel to that is terrorist networks. They use these encrypted sites, and it's impossible to monitor them, right? And the site providers will tell you that their technology is not there for them to do electronic surveillance on those. And what they do I think it's sure they do the same thing with human trafficking, but on the internet sites for terrorists, if someone shows propensity to want to be involved in terrorist activities or getting terrorist content, they just tell them to go to X site. And when they go to X site, we can't go there. As you know, we can't do the wires. We can't do electronic surveillance because and that to me is a huge concern. And we've been trying to figure out what to do with that, but it is very, very frustrating. And I'm sure it's the same issue with you all there. So.
The last thing I would add, and I know if this goes online, I just wanted to provide a number, at least for those who believe they've either been victims of trafficking or have information about it. I just want to provide the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, and that number is 888-373-7888. So that's 888-373-7888. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Anybody else want to add anything? Yes, Elmer, go ahead, please.
One thing I haven't mentioned is the relationship between human trafficking and pornography. Increasingly, we're seeing women trafficked into situations so that they can be filmed and that material can be monetized over and over again. A National Center on Sexual Exploitation filed the first lawsuit just last week on sex trafficking, pornography together. And this partly is because we're seeing zero prosecutions from DOJ on obscenity. You have platforms, the MindGeek family of platforms has an entire platform dedicated to racist material. So Ghetto Bangers is its own platform. And you can't even believe the titles alone would shock you for the kind of anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny that is thriving on the internet. And if you don't have obscenity prosecutions, because much of this violates community standards, then it just gets worse and worse. That's the nature of brain science, shows us that this material gets worse, and younger kids are being victimized and shown in pornography because the users keep looking for novelty. So unless we prosecute obscenity, this stuff is getting worse and worse. It's toxic and it's polluting millions of minds, and that leads to criminal behavior.
Anything else, Catherine or Yasmin?
Sure. I'd love to also just flag that, as we talk about the intersection between sexual violence and human trafficking, that we make sure that we also are having the conversation about what happens to labor trafficking victims. Labor trafficking victims face a really wide range of efforts to force them and defraud them and coerce them into staying in a working situation. And a huge part of that is sexual violence. A couple of years ago, we looked at the data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline around what was happening with the top type of labor trafficking that was reported to us, and that is domestic workers. So we released a report last year with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, breaking down what was going on with trafficking of domestic workers. And at least 10% of them said that they faced sexual violence as the primary method by which they were forced to do their work. Right. So as this task force is thinking more broadly about how it might tackle some of these issues, including notification of whether or not the perpetrator has been released and other ideas that come up here, Polaris would just really encourage you to think about the broad